Let's get right into it. You ever have one of those days where you just wish everyone would go away? A quiet commute, no line at the coffee shop, the blissful, uninterrupted silence of a world without people. It's a tempting little fantasy. But if that fantasy actually came true, if every single human on Earth simultaneously ghosted the planet, the silence would be the absolute last thing you'd notice. The world wouldn't just get quiet. It would get loud, then dark, then wild, faster and more brutally than you could ever imagine. This isn't a slow, gentle return to nature. This is what would happen starting in the very first few hours and days if we all just vanished. Picture this. You're a ghost, I guess, floating in your now empty living room. You flip a switch, nothing. You try the TV, dead. You drift over to Times Square, expecting that obnoxious, seizure-inducing glow, but it's just a canyon of dark screens. Within just a few hours to a couple of days after our collective vanishing act, the entire planet would be plunged into a darkness it hasn't seen in over a century. Why? Because the power grid isn't a magical, self-sustaining entity. It's a monstrously complex and needy beast that requires constant, obsessive attention. Most of the world's electricity comes from thermal power plants. Think coal, natural gas, and nuclear. These plants work by, to put it simply, boiling water to create steam that spins turbines. But they have an insatiable appetite for fuel. The vast automated conveyor belts and pipelines that feed them would keep running for a little while, but without human oversight to clear jams, manage reserves, and troubleshoot the million things that can go wrong, they'd start to fail. Coal plants would choke on their own supply or simply run out. Natural gas pipelines would lose pressure. But the real drama is with the computers. Power grid management is one of the most complex logistical puzzles humans have ever solved. It's a delicate, high-wire ballet of balancing electrical load with generation. Demand for power fluctuates constantly, everyone turning on their air conditioners at 3 p.m., everyone turning them off at night. Automated systems, run by legions of grid operators, are constantly rerouting power, firing up supplemental plants, and preventing overloads. Without us, these automated systems would face a situation they were never programmed for: a sudden, massive drop in demand with no one to manage the surplus. The grid would become fantastically unstable. Circuit breakers would trip, stations would automatically shut down to protect themselves, and this would trigger a cascading failure. One station goes down, putting more strain on the next, which also trips, and so on, until the whole rickety, continent-spanning system collapses like a row of dominoes. The great human-made constellations on the globe would blink out, one by one. The only lights left would be the ones powered by their own dedicated off-grid sources. And maybe a few stubborn solar panels charging a forgotten iPhone, dutifully displaying the time on a dead network for a few more hours. It's a strangely fitting first step, the removal of our most defining footprint, the artificial day we forced upon the night. In a quiet suburban house, a golden retriever named Doug is having a very confusing day. His people, who normally adhere to a strict schedule of feeding and door opening, are gone. The water bowl is empty by day 2. The house, once a sanctuary, is now a prison. This exact mundane tragedy is playing out for millions of animals across the globe. Our pets, the creatures we profess to love so much, would be among the first to face a brutal reckoning. The concept here isn't some grand ecological principle. It's the simple, cruel irony of domestication. We've spent thousands of years breeding animals to be dependent on us. And in our absence, that dependency becomes a death sentence. Most dogs and cats locked inside homes would perish from dehydration or starvation. The lucky ones, those who happen to be in a house with an open doggy door or a broken window, would find themselves in a world they are utterly unprepared for. The toy poodles, the pugs bred with such charmingly smushed faces they can barely breathe, the pampered Persian cats, they wouldn't last long. They've had the killer instincts bred out of them, replaced with an instinct for finding the comfiest spot on the couch. They would be easy prey for the animals that do know how to survive. But it gets worse. Think bigger. Think about the billions of farm animals. Chickens packed in automated barns, dairy cows hooked up to milking machines that are now just sitting there causing painful udder infections, pigs in enclosures, unable to forage. They would die in staggering numbers, creating a biohazard of truly epic proportions. Then there are the zoos. Zookeepers are diligent professionals for a reason. Without them, the carefully controlled environments would fail. Automated feeding systems would eventually jam or run empty. Power failures would shut down the electric fences of the raptor enclosures, and the heated habitats of the reptiles. For a brief chaotic period, there would be a series of bizarre breakouts. A bewildered zebra trotting through downtown Cleveland, a flock of flamingos suddenly discovering a city park fountain, a very, very dangerous tiger finding the deer population in the suburbs to be surprisingly accessible. But most would be trapped, victims of the same cages that were meant to keep them safe. We built a global interconnected arc for these creatures, and in vanishing, we've also pulled the plug on the life support. There's a battle being fought under your feet right now that you know nothing about. In every major city on Earth, there is a constant, silent war against water. The ground beneath our concrete jungles is not dry. It's saturated with groundwater, and it wants to come up. The only thing stopping it is an army of pumps, drains, and tunnels working 24/7 to move millions of gallons of water away from our foundations and tunnels. So what happens when the operators of that army vanish and the power grid we just talked about goes dark? The water wins, and it wins fast. The core story here is happening in the guts of our greatest cities. Let's take the New York City subway system. It's a masterpiece of engineering, but it's also a leaky old basement. Without its network of over 750 pumps pushing out 13 million gallons of water on a dry day, the system would begin to flood almost immediately. Within 36 hours, the tunnels would be impassable. The water would fill the lowest levels first, then creep upwards, submerging the platforms, the turnstiles, and eventually pouring out into the streets. The same thing would happen in London, where the tube is under constant threat from the River Thames and the city's underlying water table. Engineers there have the saying, "We're not draining the system, we're draining London." Without them, the river reclaims its floodplain, which just so happens to be where a lot of the city was built. This is the great, unglamorous secret of modern civilization. Our cities are not permanent structures. They are temporary fortresses holding back the tide. We think of them as solid and enduring, but they are incredibly fragile systems that require our constant intervention. The flooding wouldn't just be in the subways. Basements of skyscrapers, underground parking garages, utility tunnels, any part of our world we built by digging a hole would start to fill up. Within a week, the lowest levels of our cities would be stagnant, dark, and aquatic. This isn't a biblical flood from the heavens. It's a quiet, insidious invasion from below, as the planet begins the process of patiently, wetly erasing us. So, the lights are out, the subways are swimming pools, and things are getting weird for the local flamingo population. But all of that is just the opening act for a much more serious and much quieter problem. Dotted across the globe are over 400 nuclear power plants, and they are all massive, steaming kettles that you can't just turn off. Even after a reactor is shut down, the fuel rods inside continue to generate an immense amount of heat from residual radioactive decay. Stopping this heat is not possible. You can't flip an off switch on physics. The only thing you can do is continuously cool it. And that requires a constant, uninterrupted flow of electricity to power the cooling pumps. You see where this is going. When the main power grid fails, every nuclear plant automatically switches to its on-site diesel generators. These are the last line of defense. But these generators are not perpetual motion machines. They have a finite amount of fuel, typically enough to last for a few days to a week. No humans, no refueling. So one by one around the world, the generators will sputter and die. And that's when the real countdown begins. The cooling pumps stop. The water in the pools surrounding the spent fuel rods and in the reactor core itself begins to boil off. Once the water is gone, the rods are exposed to the air, and they rapidly overheat. This is the beginning of a meltdown. It's not the giant mushroom cloud explosion you see in movies. It's something slower, and in some ways more insidious. The zirconium cladding on the fuel rods will react with the steam, producing hydrogen gas. That gas builds up inside the containment building until a spark, and there are plenty of sparks in a failing industrial facility, ignites it, causing a massive chemical explosion. This is what happened at Fukushima. The explosion breaches the containment building, venting radioactive particles directly into the atmosphere. The fuel itself melts into a lava-like substance called corium, which can burn through the remaining steel and concrete, potentially contaminating the soil and groundwater beneath the plant. Over the course of a few weeks to a month, dozens of these nuclear plants would follow this exact sequence of failure, releasing plumes of radioactive isotopes like cesium-137 and strontium-90 into the wind, to be carried across continents and oceans. We built these incredible monuments to our own cleverness, And they would become our most lasting toxic legacy, silently poisoning the world for thousands of years after we were gone. You ever notice how, if you skip mowing your lawn for 2 weeks, it starts to look like you're cultivating a miniature wilderness? Or how one determined little weed can, against all odds, shove its way through a crack in your driveway? Now imagine that on a global scale with no one left to pull the weeds. The reclamation of our cities by nature wouldn't take centuries. It would start almost immediately. This process is called ecological succession, and it is a relentless, unstoppable force. In the first year, it's all about the pioneer species. These are the botanical thugs of the plant world: dandelions, thistle, clover, and that bane of all gardeners, crabgrass. Their seeds are everywhere, and our perfectly manicured, sun-drenched lawns and roadsides are their ideal territory. With no herbicides being sprayed and no lawnmowers running, they would explode in growth. Cracks in the pavement, widened by the freeze-thaw cycle of the first winter, would become their entry points. Their roots would push deeper, breaking up asphalt and concrete, turning our sidewalks into a mosaic of green. But that's just the beginning. Within 5 years, those pioneer weeds are joined by larger, woodier plants. Fast-growing trees like ailanthus, the tree of heaven that can famously grow in the most inhospitable urban crevices, and mulberry would take root. Their roots are far more destructive, capable of buckling roads, invading sewer lines, and compromising the foundations of smaller buildings. Vines like ivy and kudzu, the undisputed champion of vegetative dominance, would swarm over everything. In the American South, entire neighborhoods would be draped in a single monolithic green blanket of kudzu within a decade. Our houses, offices, and strip malls would become nothing more than trellises for a new wild garden. The straight, clean lines of our architecture would blur, softened, and then shattered by the patient, persistent pressure of roots and stems. We think of our structures as permanent, but they are standing in defiance of a biological imperative. Without our constant, obsessive maintenance, the concrete jungle stops being a metaphor and starts becoming a literal and very wild forest. So with the humans gone, what happens in the animal kingdom? Your first thought is probably a glorious revenge fantasy. The pests lose, and the majestic wildlife returns. You're picturing rats and cockroaches, the uninvited roommates of civilization finally getting their comeuppance. But you'd be spectacularly wrong. In fact, two of the species that would suffer the most in our absence are the very ones we associate most with filth and resilience: the common city rat and the German cockroach. This is the great paradox of the synanthrope, an animal that has evolved to thrive in human-made habitats. We didn't just create a world for ourselves, we created a 5-star all-you-can-eat buffet for them, and we just canceled the service. The Norway rat, the kind that scurries through subway tunnels and back alleys, is utterly dependent on our garbage. Our overflowing dumpsters, leaky pipes, and heated buildings are its entire ecosystem. Without a constant supply of discarded pizza crusts and whatever else constitutes the horrifying sludge at the bottom of a trash bag, their populations would crash spectacularly. They would face starvation and increased predation from the newly liberated cats and hawks. The same goes for the German cockroach. It isn't some hardy wild insect. It's a creature that has specifically adapted to the climate-controlled interiors of our buildings. It can't survive a cold winter. As our homes cool down and the free food disappears, they'd be wiped out across vast swaths of the globe. So who wins? The animals we pushed out. The coyotes, bears, and deer that were living on the fringes of our suburbs would move in, finding our overgrown parks and cul-de-sacs to be prime real estate. Bird populations would go wild. Without our glass skyscrapers causing millions of collisions a year and our pesticides decimating their insect food supply, their numbers would explode. The true winners are the generalists and the apex predators who were suppressed by our presence. The balance of power, which for centuries has been artificially tilted in favor of the small things that could live in our shadows, would violently swing back. The world wouldn't get cleaner and nicer, it would get wilder and redder in tooth and claw. Our disappearance doesn't just get rid of us, it firebombs the entire ecological order we accidentally created. In San Francisco, the Golden Gate Bridge stands not just as a marvel of engineering, but as a testament to constant, obsessive work. It takes about 30 full-time painters and 17 ironworkers to continuously battle the bridge's greatest enemy, the salty, humid air. Their job never ends. By the time they finish painting the entire 10 million square foot surface, it's time to start over again. In a world without us, that war ends in an instant defeat. For our greatest metal structures, the enemy isn't a dramatic earthquake or a Hollywood monster. It's a quiet, patient chemical reaction. It's rust. The concept is oxidation, but the story is one of spectacular, slow-motion decay. Steel, the backbone of our civilization, is not a natural substance. It's iron that we forcibly infuse with carbon in a blast furnace, an energy-intensive process to make it strong. But like a tightly wound spring, it wants to return to its lower energy, more stable state, iron oxide. That's all rust is, the metal breathing out and returning to dust. Without painters to maintain its protective coating, the salt fog would begin to corrode the steel of the Golden Gate almost immediately. The iconic orange paint would flake, bubble, and peel, exposing the raw metal beneath. Over the first few decades, the damage would seem cosmetic. But beneath the surface, the rust would be eating away at the structural integrity. The first things to go would be the smaller support pieces. Then, the immense suspension cables, each one a bundle of over 27,000 individual steel wires, would start to fail. Water would seep between the wires, corroding them from the inside out. One by one, like cosmic guitar strings, they would snap under the immense tension. After maybe 100 to 200 years, a major storm with high winds, a storm the bridge would have easily shrugged off in its prime, would be the final blow. A critical number of cables would sever, the load would shift catastrophically, and the main span would twist and collapse into the bay below. The same fate awaits every steel bridge, every skyscraper skeleton, every metal monument we ever built. They are all just temporary anomalies, fighting a losing battle against basic chemistry. Humanity's most audacious attempts to play God can be found in our dams. We've thrown colossal wedges of concrete into the paths of the world's mightiest rivers, holding back trillions of gallons of water and fundamentally reshaping entire landscapes. The Hoover Dam, for example, holds back so much water in Lake Mead that it actually warped the Earth's crust. But these monuments to our own hubris are not static objects. They are high-maintenance machines under unimaginable constant strain. And without their human keepers, they become the world's largest water bombs, all with their timers ticking. The failure of a dam isn't necessarily a single dramatic explosion. It's a death by 1,000 cuts. First, there's silt. Rivers carry sediment, and for decades, that sediment has been building up against the upstream face of every dam, putting more and more pressure on the structure and clogging the mechanisms that control water flow. Then there's the concrete itself. Concrete cracks. Without engineers to monitor, grout, and repair these fissures, water will seep in. Over decades of freezing and thawing, that water will widen the cracks, slowly compromising the dam's integrity from the inside out. The most likely point of failure, however, would be the spillway gates. These are the giant steel valves that allow operators to release water during floods. They are controlled by electronics that have long since gone dark and are powered by motors that require maintenance. Over 100 or maybe 150 years, these gates, rusted and stuck, would be unable to cope with a major once-in-a-century flood, an event that happens, on average, once a century. The water would overtop the dam. This is the point of no return. The deluge pouring over the crest would erode the downstream face of the dam, undermining its very foundation. The structure would fail catastrophically. The entire contents of Lake Mead would be unleashed in a single, terrifying wave. A wall of water hundreds of feet high scouring the landscape, wiping out everything for miles downstream, and ultimately returning the Colorado River to the wild, untamed path it once carved. Multiply that by thousands of dams around the world, and the post-human landscape is violently redrawn by a series of man-made, nature-driven cataclysms. Go outside tonight in any major city and look up. You might see the moon, a planet or two, and a handful of the brightest stars. It's a sparse and lonely-looking universe. It's also a complete illusion. You're not seeing the sky, you're seeing the reflection of your own city. The greatest, most profound, and quietest change to happen in the decades after we vanish is that the universe would reappear. The concept is simple: light pollution. For the first time in millennia, the Earth would be truly dark at night, and the view would be staggering. Here's the thing your brain has forgotten. Our atmosphere acts like a celestial screen protector that someone has smeared with Vaseline. The billions of unshielded streetlights, office building lights, and decorative floodlights we use don't just point down, they cast a huge amount of light upwards. This light scatters off molecules of air and dust, creating a luminous dome of sky glow that can stretch for hundreds of miles around urban centers. This ambient haze blots out all but the most brilliant points of light, effectively erasing the cosmos from our daily lives. But after we're gone and the grid has failed, that all stops. Within a few decades, as the dust from our collapsing infrastructure settles and the fires burn out, the atmosphere would return to a state of incredible clarity. From the middle of what was once Manhattan, the Milky Way would be visible not as a faint, ghostly wisp, but as a brilliant, richly detailed band of light arching across the sky. You would be able to see nebulae with the naked eye. The sky would be so thick with stars that modern constellations would be difficult to pick out from the sheer density of light. It's a beauty that is currently reserved for people in the most remote, desolate parts of the planet, the Atacama Desert or the middle of the ocean. In our absence, that cosmic grandeur would be returned to the entire world. We spent a century building a civilization that blinded itself, and our disappearance would be the thing that finally lets the planet see the universe again. After all the chaos, the floods, the fires, and the rust, what's left? What is humanity's final indelible mark on this planet? Is it the face of Mount Rushmore, the Great Wall of China? Nope. The most enduring legacy we will leave behind, the thing that will outlast our grandest monuments by millions of years, is our trash. Specifically, our plastics, our glass, and the quiet radioactive hum from our follies. In the end, our most permanent contribution to the geological record of Earth will be our garbage. Let's fast forward. 10,000 years have passed. Our cities are gone, buried under soil and vegetation, forming a distinct geological layer known as urban strata for future alien archaeologists to puzzle over. The great stone monuments, the pyramids, the Great Wall, will still exist but heavily eroded and looking more like natural formations. But what will be perfectly, infuriatingly intact? The glass bottle you tossed into a landfill. The plastic grocery bag that snagged on a now fossilized tree branch. These materials are so alien to the natural world that almost no microbe has evolved to properly digest them. They don't really biodegrade. They just break down into smaller and smaller pieces, becoming a permanent part of the soil and sediment. Now let's go even further, 100,000 years, 200,000. The radioactive signatures from those nuclear meltdowns back in the first few decades are still measurable. Isotopes like plutonium-239 have a half-life of 24,100 years, meaning they will remain dangerously radioactive for over 250,000 years, leaving a clear, man-made scar in the planet's background radiation. But even that fades compared to the sheer stubbornness of our synthetics. 1,000,000 years from now, long after the mountains we carved have worn down, a compressed layer of rock might contain the unmistakable fossilized imprints of tires, the bizarre chemical signature of a polyester shirt, or the perfectly preserved shape of a Barbie doll head. We strive for immortality through art, through architecture, through memory. But our real lasting legacy is the cheap, disposable junk we couldn't be bothered to deal with. That's our ghost, the silent plastic and plutonium fossil record that proves a strange, clever, and remarkably short-sighted species was once here. And that's our list. If you want to keep feeding your algorithm with more of this delightful nonsense, you know the drill. That subscribe button isn't going to click itself.